Welcome to everyone for this ATRASS seminar session. And today we are very happy to welcome Preben Ness, who is a final year PhD student at the Simula Research Laboratory and the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. Preben's research is on building AI models that can generalize across distribution shifts. And more specifically, he worked on causal representation learning using the idea of causal inference to shape the latent representation, particularly in deep learning models. He did his undergraduate and master studies at Cambridge in information engineering. And before starting his PhD, Preben spent 3 years working as an AI developer in industry. So I think we can say he has the point of view from the industrial side and from the research side as well. And his talk will be about causal neural networks for robust generalization. Thank you very much again, Preben, for being here. And yeah, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you for that introduction. Yes, I have. I've tried to frame this in a more sort of industry-focused side today, but balance a bit the research and the industrial focus. You can see the screen, okay? You see the title?
Yes.
All right. So I'm presenting this this paper here that I wrote some months ago. A survey of causal discriminative neural networks. And I think the easiest thing to start off with is to just like analyze the title a bit. It's a bit of a long title. So this is a survey paper, which means that I've read a bunch of papers that other people have done, models that other people have made and analyzed them. And there's this discriminative word, discriminative neural networks. So a discriminative model is a model of, for example, a classifier illustrated in this image here. You have some pictures of cats, you have some pictures of dogs. You would like to discriminate between them or differentiate between them. Or you have the stock price today. You would like to predict the stock price tomorrow. This is an extremely common type of model in industry, even though right now it's probably not as famous as generative neural networks, which is what we have with like ChatGPT and image generators and those sorts of models. But I would say that discriminative models are still a cornerstone of industrial applications. And then there's causal. What does it mean to be a causal discriminative model? I think we'll get back to that. That's sort of what this talk is about. So let me motivate by something that I think is quite familiar to a lot of people. Let's say that you want to build this cat and dog classifier from the example here. So you gather some images. Yes? Sorry? No? Just interrupt if you have questions.
Yeah, don't worry, Ben, thank you.
You gather a bunch of images of cats and dogs and you label them and you train your neural network model and you get 96% accuracy. But then you think, okay, but maybe my model has just memorized the particular training data I gave it. I want to deploy this model, so I need to check that it works sort of like in real life. So you have a set of images that the model has never seen before. It's called the test set. You give it to the model, right? 94%, slightly worse, but incredibly useful. You're feeling confident. Let's deploy this model. So you send it to your boss, and he deploys it at the factory or whatever, and then okay, in real life it gets like 42%, or something like really bad. So why does this happen? Because you tested it on this held out test data set, but still in real life it doesn't work particularly well. I think we can understand this by looking at this famous example. This is 10 years old now. from an image recognition model, trying to classify whether a picture is of a dog, of a wolf, or of a husky. So it had the same sort of situation where the model got good results when you trained it and when you tested it, but in real life, it didn't quite work out. And then you look at this model and you say, like, why is this left image here classified as a wolf? And then you can look at the what's called the lime explanation. It's essentially looking at the pixels in the image that were important when determining this prediction for the model. And you see the model is just looking at the snow in the image and thinking, like, okay, that's probably a wolf. There's a similar example from another paper 2 years later where we try to classify images of cows, and then you train on images that look like the ones on the left. You have these beautiful Swiss landscapes and grass and mountains, and then the model is good at recognizing cows in that context, but when you try it on the middle or the right panel, then that works quite poorly. And in the previous example, the model had learned to associate snow and wolf. Here it's learned to associate grass and cow. It's the same idea. And I would argue that the model hasn't really done anything wrong. It has just like fitted the data that you gave to it. But this is obviously not like the performance that we want. We train a model to recognize cows. We want it to recognize cows like everywhere. So then the question is, what should the model be learning? If the model should not learn to look at the grass and not the snow, then what should it learn instead? This depends a lot on the exact problem that you're trying to solve. But to answer it, on a high level, but generally, we need to talk about latent variables. And to explain what latent variable is, just this example. This is from quite a recent paper where you try and explain some data that is incredibly complicated. In this case, it's pictures of food. Images are very high dimensional. They have lots of pixels. There's lots of information in any one of these pictures of food. But you would like to sort of explain these complicated images using some simpler underlying concepts. And in this example on the figure here, they've used the concept of, is the food cooked or raw? So that's what the horizontal axis is altering, and then the vertical axis is saying, is this like fancy food or not fancy? And then by taking different combinations of these, you sort of get all the individual image cells. And this applies to the cow as well, and the cow and the grass. So the types of models that I will be talking about today, and the types of models that I've surveyed in this paper, do this decomposition into, we call them latent variables. You can think of them as concepts from the data. In this example here, if you're interested in classifying the image on the left as having the label cow, you can split these latent variables into things you care about for the classification, which is the top box labeled C. This is the shape of the cow, the shape of the face of the cow, and then there's like all the rest of the information in the image, which we call S, the grass and the lighting and the trees in the background. C, this is why they're called, this type of model is called a causal neural network, and that's because The C group here stands for, there's the causal information in the image is the information that causally influences the label. And S stands for spurious, which is a technical term for not causal. If you'd like, and you find it easier, you can think of it as C standing for content and S standing for style. That's sort of the same idea. So we have content C, style S, illustrated here in this quite famous data set called colored MNIST, where you have handwritten digits that you try and train a model to recognize, is this a 0 or a 1 or a 2 or whatever. And then you artificially add this style, this color. And then there's this sort of third concept we care about called environment, denoted by the letter E. And in this talk that I'm giving, environment has a very particular meaning, and environment means which particular data set your samples came from. So this is illustrated in the figure here by these 3 rows of data. And if you look at the distribution of colors in each row, you'll see that it differs quite a lot. So the top row, I think all the even numbers are green, and in the bottom row, it's the high numbers tend to be green. And so they're different. There are different statistical patterns within each row. And that makes it very difficult to, for example, train on one of these rows and then have a model that works well on another row. So train on one environment, test on another environment, which is essentially why your models fail in deployment, because there is this environmental change. So the last thing that is required to think about this as what we call a causal model is that these variables, content and style, and X here being the input data, so the image, Y being the label that you want to predict, they affect each other in a particular way. And different papers will make different assumptions about how these concepts affect each other. This is one example, which I think is quite intuitive. You can think of it as the content, which is the letter C. The content says this is an image of a cow, and the arrows denote which other variables that C is affecting. So C, and there's an arrow between C and X, meaning that the fact that this is a cow affects the pixels in the image X. And then S is the style, which also affects the image, but S does not affect Y, which is the label. And you can formalize this mathematically. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the formalisms, but just to give sort of like an intuition, there's this idea of what's called an intervention, which is essentially saying, with all of these concepts that I have defined, what happens if I change one of them, and then sort of how that affects the rest of my variables. So in this, this is denoted by this do operator. If you want to learn more about this, Google do calculus. It's quite interesting, but the details don't really matter for this talk. And the result in this case, if you change the style, okay, you will affect the image X, the pixels in the image, but you will not affect the label Y. So you will get an image that looks something like this. This is a different styled image of the same cow, which should have the same label. So why the label is the same. That's what we're trying to get our models to understand, and that's quite difficult to get the model to understand. So this entire paper has been me and my co-authors looking at a bunch of these causal neural networks I think we analyzed 60 in total. And then we asked which latent variables or which concepts do each of these papers try to model, and how do they model them? And then we talk about the what we've mentioned so far, that your options are the content C, the style S, and the environment E. These are sort of the high-level concepts we care about, and which ones that a particular approach tries to model is sort of what gives us our classification of that model. This is the end result of the paper. Each one of these green blocks is one of the models that we looked at, and then we placed it on this big map that shows sort of different families of models. We're not gonna like go through all the different areas here. It's quite a complicated diagram. Everything's in the paper for those that are interested, but I'll do sort of a simplified explanation of how we've clustered these different models. So the first sort of general class of approaches we call causal feature learning, CFL. And this has conceptually, it's very straightforward. You have some sort of image, or some sort of input that could be an image. I'm going to use images quite a lot in this presentation because they're easy to understand and nice to look at, but it could be text or, whatever. It doesn't have to be an image. You have some sort of input, then you have a model F that takes that input and tries to extract this C, this causal or content variable that we care about. And then you have a classifier trying to predict the label. And then you sort of strip away everything else. That's the goal of this class of model, the CFL. There are some different ways of doing this. I'm going to briefly describe two models, two out of the 60. The one on the left here is called CBD. They all have acronyms. They use a very heuristic approach. They say that we will start with some poisoned data. So that is, for example, images that have been, you've added some noise to, you've been perturbed in some way. And then you train a model FA, and then you take your clean data and you train a model FB, which is on the bottom. And then you say, the predictions of these two models should be different. And then the idea is that the model that's trained on the corrupted data should latch on to all these sort of spurious shortcuts that we want to avoid. And then when you train your second model to be different to the first model, then in theory, it should learn these like invariant causal information. Then there's another type of approach called invariance-based, which I think is on the next slide here. Yeah. And the idea here is that if you have the causal information, the C information that you're interested in is constant. It's what's in common between different types of like, for example, the first row here is different images of dogs. There's one that's painted, there's one that's a cartoon, there's one that's a sketch. What's in common, what doesn't change between those four images is the invariant feature that you would like your model to learn. And you can do this very, very explicitly. You can try and train a model to classify animals from the left column of painting examples, and from the cartoon column, and from the photo column, and from the sketch column. And then you see, okay, what's the performance of my model across all of these environments? And then you say, I would like the to train the model that has the most stable performance across these. It should do equally well across all of these environments. So that's one approach, but causal feature learning. But you throw away this this spurious style. You throw away the information about the grass in the image. That information can potentially be useful, so it's perhaps like an overly cautious approach to just get rid of it. So this is sort of the second class of models. Back to our cow example here, the CFL models only look at the top box, and now this new approach will look at the S box as well. And then we essentially take this conceptual figure here, and then we try and build a type of neural net that looks like this. This is the general architecture that these models use. You have X, your input, that's processed in some way. And then what's called a separation mechanism that attempts to disentangle these two sort of abstract concepts, the content and the style. And then you use your content on the top, your C, to do classification or regression or whatever your main objective is. And then you have a second task on the bottom, the auxiliary loss, that you use your style information to do, because you need some way of training the style information, the S, as well. Otherwise, it will just end up as noise. So this is a real world example. There's a model called IRON. They all have very interesting acronyms. So IRON takes a big data set, and then it partitions it up into different splits, so different environments. And then for each sample X that it feeds to its prediction machine, to its model, it will have one arm that tries to predict the label. That's the top arm here. And then a symmetric arm or another prediction head on the model that tries to predict which dataset split did this particular sample come from. And you train this model in a way that the C branch is very good at predicting the label, but very bad at predicting the environment. And then the S branch is very good at predicting the environment, but very bad at predicting the label. So each of the two heads is sort of bad at each other's job. That's quite an effective strategy. I would say, like, generally, if you find this a bit sort of abstract to think about when I talk about sort of causal and spurious information in an input, it can be helpful to just think of it as this content style disentanglement, which is quite an established concept, and particularly in computer vision, exemplified here in a famous paper where you take the same image and then you apply the style of different famous paintings. So if this helps you sort of conceptualize it, I like to think of it this way sometimes. So then, okay, you have a way of extracting information about this style, this S, but then what do you do with it? There's this equation here on the left. It's called a backdoor adjustment, if you would like to look it up. If you don't care that much about the mathematics of it, then I will say that what this equation does is that instead of taking a single input image or a single input sample and then predicting a label, you take your input X and then you combine it with all kinds of different styles, all different types of S values. And you sort of make an average prediction. You average over all these possible styles. So to make this concrete, on the right here, if you were to train a model to recognize handwritten digits from this colored MNIST data set, then that would correspond to, for each image that you try and predict on, you sort of say, what if this image was red? Then I would make this prediction. What if it was green? Then I would make this prediction. And then you do that for all the colors, and then you average it. It's the informal way of describing what a backdoor adjustment is. Okay, so far we have looked at models that just learn the causal content, models that learn the causal content and the style signal. And then a natural question is, if I'm interested in learning this S signal, where should what does it represent? So like in this example, because this is a synthetic data set, S has the interpretation of being the color feature. S tells you what is the color of this image that I'm looking at. But in general, what should you interpret this sort of this style as? This is one of the models that we analyzed. It's called Visual Common Sense Region CNN, I think is what that R stands for. But the point is that this model tries to do image or object detection in an image. It tries to take these images that we can see examples of here, and then it tries to, I think from knowing what's in green, so on the leftmost image, from knowing that is a dining table, can you predict what the red thing is supposed to be labeled? So in this case, that's supposed to be labeled as sink. And what they have observed, the authors, what motivated this model was that all the other stuff in yellow, so in the leftmost image, the toaster and the refrigerator, all of that stuff can be correlated with other labels. So for example, it'll probably be very common to see refrigerators and toasters, or refrigerators and sinks appearing in the same image. So that's a type of spurious correlation, like the grass and the cow example we looked at. That's sort of, you want to try and get rid of that. So then for each individual image here, just the approach is to consider all these things in yellow as your sort of like your style, your S variable. In the screenshot here that I've taken, in the paper they use the letter Z instead of S, but in our notation it would be S. And then you can
sorry to interrupt. I see a short question from Bertrand. Maybe Bertrand, you can ask it, or
yeah. Please go ahead.
So no, it's okay. You can read, but okay. But I was wondering if there's just usually one S and one C, or maybe in some cases people have tried to learn several C, several S, which have different interests. By the way, have you seen that?
Yes, very very good question. In general, there could be. So to take this example, you consider the S to be the refrigerator and the toaster, the yellow stuff in the image. But that means that you're not correcting for anything else. So any other bias that exists in your data set, you're just like not considering at all. So maybe if you wanted to adjust for this co-occurrence of labels, in addition to adjusting for, I don't know, like some bias in like the time of day the images were taken, or, you know, whatever, they are probably all taken in daylight. So then that could be like a second, like you say, a second set of S that you would want to adjust for. The different models adjust for just some of them. Some try and adjust for all of them. That's more difficult. It depends a lot on the problem you're trying to solve. But yeah, very good observation. Right. So in this example, when you know beforehand what you want to adjust for, you can do this very explicitly. I think this is the slide that has the most mathematics on it. So if you're not that into mathematics, then I'll try and explain it in words as well. So this is the same model, the visual common sense RCNN. We have the labels of all the yellow regions, and we have sort of like the average pixel values of those yellow regions. And then we would like to approximate this averaging over all possible S values, which is can be written in sort of neural network terms as a softmax, an expectation of a softmax, which is the first equation here. Now, there's this sort of computational trick that you can use to avoid having to compute this quantity for all possible combinations of S values. And then so instead of taking in the average of a bunch of predictions, you take the prediction of sort of like an average S value. That's essentially what these two lines are saying. And that saves you a lot of computational headache, and it's quite a good approximation. And that's quite a common way of doing things. So that's the case where you know what your S is going to be, or you've chosen the particular S that you care about, and then you disregard all the rest. A second case is if you don't know what the S is, you would sort of try and adjust like generally for things that could be spuriously correlated with your label. You need some sort of approximation. And there's this model called DICE, which makes the assumption that if you start with quite a reasonably well-trained image recognition model, and then for each pixel, you compute the gradient of the output with respect to that pixel, which means how much does the output change if I change, this pixel or this pixel or this pixel. And then you say the pixels that matter a lot for the prediction, they're going to be my causal pixels, and whatever's left over, that's going to be my spurious, my S pixels. Now this is a crude approximation, but it works reasonably well. And then you can, for each image that you have, each input sample, you can compute, what's the C value, what's the S value, and use in your computation if you want to average over all S values, for example. Yes, which is
before.
Yeah?
Sorry, before you move on that slide, I see Laurent is asking a question. So the question is, does it mean that S is supposed to be a set of finite known labels? Would it work for S if S was continuous or completely unknown? Yeah.
Very, very good question. I think this slide here actually deals with it. Here we have an example of a continuous S. On the left here. This is a very crude approximation, but what this CISS is the name of the model. What it does is that it says, I'm gonna take my input X, and then I'm gonna feed it through some sort of embedder to get this Z, this sort of lower dimensional representation of it. And then I am going to say that different S values, they are just random noise, Gaussian random noise added to whatever the sort of the true Z of the image is. And then you take the average over, you sample and you take finitely many, but in principle, you take the full average over this continuous variable. This is both good and bad. It allows you to sort of deal with this S, this expectation, this averaging over the S, more sort of mathematically rigorously. But it also means that you're saying that all the possible variations in S that I could possibly care about are quite close to the actual image or the actual input that I care about, because you're just taking the average in a small region around the true signal. This is essentially the same idea that people use when they use adversarial training, for those that are into that kind of stuff. It's a very mathematically, it's almost the same idea. So that
I have just thank you very much. Maybe a little remark, I think related to the one of Laurent. Maybe formally it would be rather here an integral rather than a discrete sum, or
yeah, exactly. So well, I mean, like analytically it would be an integral, but in practice you would have to do a finite number of samples, right? Yes, that's
thank you.
A good point. But in practice, in most cases, you use sort of you either use discrete samples or you consider S to be a discrete variable. But in principle, you can apply the same equations, just replace the sum sign with an integral sign, essentially. But so the CISS approach of like smoothing in a region around your input, I call it a local approach, but you can also we call it the non-local approach, which is instead of saying that the S values that you care about are sort of computed from the sample that you're looking at that particular moment, you can take a bunch of samples in your data set, and then you compute your C and S values for all of them, and then you can like combine them randomly, right? You can take an image and then you can have a memory bank of the S values of all the other images, and then combine those when you take the average. So that would be sort of what's called a non-local approach. So that would be computationally more expensive, but it's usually a more realistic estimate of like this expectation. Okay, I think I will. How are we doing for time? 36 minutes. That's quite good. I want to end on talking about how the work that I've analyzed and described here, how that sort of connects to the rest of the world of deep learning and neural networks. And I have hinted to and mentioned some of these connections during my talk. But I would like to make them explicit here. If you remember, we talked about CFL, causal feature learning. You want to learn just the C, the invariant signal. That same idea exists in the literature under the name of invariant learning. It's just that people who call it invariant learning don't sort of formalize it mathematically by using these causal graphs and the do calculus, and they just sort of motivate it more heuristically. But it's when you get down to it, it's the same thing you're doing. Similarly, with causal representation learning, which is this learning your C and your S. I think I've argued quite a lot during this talk that you're essentially doing content style disentanglement. You're like we saw with the image, the picture in the style of different painters. And as we mentioned just now, when you take this S, the spurious, or it's called a confounder. Some people call it a confounder. When you adjust for this locally, in a small region around your input, that's essentially adversarial training. It's essentially replacing your samples with adversarially perturbed versions of themselves. So my point is that all these models apply this sort of causal mathematical framework to come up with some really, really good techniques, but some of them are also just sort of like formalisms of existing techniques. So you should see this field of causal neural networks as more of a formalization of ideas that have been floating around for a long while. So with this is sort of the overview of the taxonomy. We've touched on most of the regions in this Venn diagram: causal feature learning, causal representation learning. You know, do you know your confounder? Confounder is the S here. Do you know your S? Do you not know your S? Do you approximate it locally or non-locally? There are some details I've skipped over in the interest of time, but for those that are interested, in the appendix to the paper, I do a full analysis of each of these 60 models and I explain, like, okay, why does it live in that particular region of this diagram? So let me end with some open problems. I think there are two main open problems. We have touched a bit on this already. We talk about content and style, CNS. What does it mean for them to be like correct? Can I give you a data set and can you tell me like, oh, I think the C value for this image is this value, and then I can say, no, that's incorrect, or yes, that's correct. We don't, for real world data, we don't have access to the true values of these latent factors, right? We're just like conceptualizing data as having been generated from simple unseen factors. There's a bunch of metrics for sort of assessing the correctness of what the model learns vis-a-vis the correct factors that generated the data, but that requires you to have synthetic data where you sort of, you do the generation, so you know the value of these, your latent factors, whatever you choose them to be. The second sort of big ask that I write at the end of the paper is almost all these models are in the domain of the noted CV, computer vision, in my paper. And that's, there are some reasons for it, but I think it's largely a lost opportunity, because a lot of these models and a lot of these techniques are equally well applicable to, time series or natural language or, graphs or whatever. It just happens to be that computer vision data sets are very popular for this because you can see what's going on quite nicely. So if any of this is interesting and you want to look at, any one of these models, I would say don't feel like these ideas are limited to the field of computer vision. So I've categorized these models by which latent variables they model and how they model them. That's sort of the two axes of this two-dimensional map of all the models. And this is not a separate field from, the rest of neural networks. Because the idea in all of these 60 models is essentially this idea here. How do you avoid this situation? Which I think is relevant to basically all industrial and research applications of AI models. So with that, I say thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Preben, for the presentation. So we now have time for questions. Any question in the audience? Yes, Bertrand, please.
Yeah, thank you. That was really very interesting. And I appreciate the slide before last, because I was going to ask you about other domains other from vision, and you already replied. But so I have a completely different question, because are these used also in real world applications, or are these only research models?
Big, interesting question. Some of them, well, so like, okay, all these 60 papers are research papers, right? But
yes.
For example, the visual common sense RCNN here, I think that paper has like 9,000 citations or something. So it is also, it has been well disseminated in industry, and it's a reasonably standard technique. That particular ones is, yeah, some have seen some mainstream usage, others not so much.
Okay. Thank you. Martin?
Martin, yes.
Yes, hello. Thank you for this talk. I was going to ask a question more or less in the same sense of Bertrand, so, but maybe I'm going to rephrase it in a different way. So I know a little bit about invariant learning. So essentially with IR, invariant risk minimization, what you do is you have a predetermined set of environments, whether these are discrete or continuous, but you have a predetermined, like predefined set of them. And then the assumption is that you still, you learn the true invariant mechanism somehow, right? And the question that I was going to ask is essentially the same as Bertrand, as how do we, in this particular area, how do we evaluate that these assumptions, like the predetermined set of environments and true invariant, we can learn the true invariant mechanism, that these assumptions work in practice? From the point of view of evaluation, I'm thinking like this is a typical problem with the spurious correlations, right? You have like two data sets, two benchmarks, say water birds, so birds that are of land or in water, have another data set, and then you have like leaderboards, same methods. In one, you have 1, 2, 3, 4 up until 20. And you see in the other data set, you think that it's going to do more or less the same, but actually it looks like a random shuffle. So I know that the evaluation part is it's pretty difficult, even before deployment. So is it something that you've looked a little bit more in detail?
Yeah, I'm working on a paper now where we sort of try and deal a bit more, think a bit more carefully about how do you evaluate these models, because you're right that so for the people who might not know water birds, that's a data set that essentially looks like the cow example that I used, where you have images with birds with a water background, and then you try and recognize birds with like non-water backgrounds. In order to assess how well your model works, you need to put some bounds on the change in distribution, right? You need to say, so for colored emness, for example, you need to say, okay, I want my model to be invariant to changes in colors. But then you could rightly ask, okay, but should it be equally invariant to like all types of changes in color? Are there some changes that I care more about? Do I expect my colors to change a bit between training and deploying, or do I expect them to change a lot? Do I care about the worst case change, or do I care about the average change? These are, you know, engineering considerations, and they don't have like a right or wrong answer, but there's something you definitely need to think about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions? Yeah, I have one question, a little bit technical, Preben. The way you train the latent S from, if I understand well, S is a kind of latent visual dictionary. And yeah, my question is, I don't see the number of your slides, but there is one in which you have this conditional distribution, and in which you marginalize out S. So yeah, the question, how do you train that S is not observed? So yeah, my question for the training, this is a kind of latent variable model. So which kind of algorithm you use for training?
So this is essentially what you're asking is the distinction between the unknown confounder and the known confounder blocks in this diagram, because in you can either assume that you know the values of S that you care about beforehand, like in like in the example we looked at with a co-occurrence of objects, or you could I think it's on this slide. Yeah, you can try and estimate it through some sort of like in this mechanism, you can use a heuristic to try and estimate it. Then you can do some essentially you can bootstrap the learning of this S by having a model that's bad at separating the S and the C, but then you have sort of an adversarial model that tries to trick your primary model to make it harder to separate these two. Yeah, you could some you can consider S to be exactly identical to your environment split. So like which data set am I in is what you mean by S. Yeah, it's a tough question, and solving it correctly is like what makes a good model.
Okay. I see. I was also wondering if there would be a relation between that and the traditional way of training, for example, variational autoencoders. Do you see any connection? In the sense, we could consider S as a latent variable we need as well to infer it from the data?
Yeah. I think, I mean, if we talk about this example here, right, is something you could, this is a typical like latent VAE type model where you try and learn, two distinct factors of variation. You could, in this paper, I've tried to avoid VAEs in particular because they're sort of like a really big class of generative models. So I've tried to avoid all models that have a reconstruction or that are generative, so have like a reconstruction head. But you could, I have done some work on a model that couples a VAE. So you would do a VAE on, these images of food here, and then you would look at the factors that you get from that VAE, and then you could say which ones are the most predictive for my label. And then that allows you to at least, you don't know what is S and what is C, but it allows you to sort of have a set of, say, 10 latent variables, and then the task becomes assigning each one to S or C during training, for example. You could do.
Okay. Thank you very much. We still have 1 or 2 minutes for questions. Any additional question? I'm waiting for another final question. Just more general question, maybe. Now, the way you learn your latent S, if I understand well, there is no necessarily structure open these S's. In general, in some approaches in causality, some people try to assume they are organized in a kind of network or graph. Would that make sense? Would that make sense in this setting? Here, from statistical point of view, we could think about S like independent variables, actually. Would that make sense to think about them in a kind of more structured setting? Typically a graph, actually.
Yeah, you could. There was one of these 60 papers that talks about S is specifically so they say that S denotes sort of like data augmentation. So they try and like, let's say you take an image and then you rotate it by X number of degrees, and then they say that, okay, S is the number of degrees that I rotate. So you sort of say that S is what parameterizes a function that maps from your image to sort of like a perturbed image. And that gives you some structure you can work with. It means that you won't capture other sources of bias, but if you have a particular application where you know quite a lot about the types of biases you would like to adjust for, then applying, like forcing S to have a particular structure that only captures that bias can be a good trade-off. It means you miss some things, but it also means that you're probably better at catching the things you care about.
Yeah, kind of prior regularization. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much again, Preben, for this very interesting presentation.